Everybody's here. So this is, I think, billed as a talk maybe. I'm hoping to some extent will become a conversation rather than a talk. If I just talk here, of course, we will when you give a professor a microphone, it might go forever, but the other might just be done in a rather shorter time. And hopefully it will bring up some interesting questions as well. I wanted to talk a bit about thinking of yourself as a future professional, maybe current professional in mathematics, and sprinkle in a little bit of how things evolved for me from the early days of graduate school until the few years following. So, for instance, one question that a number of you are still pondering is how to find an advisor, what kinds of considerations go into that. And the good news is there's a good supply of good advisors here. When I made that decision, it was under somewhat unusual circumstances. I'd just changed from physics to mathematics at the University of Maryland. And in my first year, in that spring, I got a letter. These were the olden days, it was a letter, not an email. I got a letter from someone with whom I'd taken a class, and he said, well, I'm on leave this year, and I will not be returning to Maryland. I'm going to Caltech instead, and if you're interested, you could go to Caltech and work with me over there. So then I had to make this decision remotely, in essence, and the good thing is I did have people to talk to, notably some current students of his who were still around. And that certainly is a good source of information, right? The experiences of students who are currently working with an advisor or recent graduates, for instance, tell you something about how an advisor is to work with. And by how I don't just mean good or bad. You know, it's just you're matching two personalities, yours and your advisor's. And there are some styles that suit some students and others that do not. All of them can be good for some. Another thing is, of course, to some extent, if you're already worried about it, it's not a bad thing to think about. Does your advisor have a reasonable track record of getting students jobs after the PhD? And we generally, as an institution, have done pretty well. So again, for you concretely, it's not an urgent concern in terms of picking from one versus the other. But certainly I've seen at other places that the record is a bit mixed. So let me frame some of the things I want to say about the graduate school experience in terms of thinking about life after, because after all, being a graduate student is not an end in itself. Life after is where you're really headed. And I frankly, when I started and while I was in graduate school, for the most part, did not have any clear idea of what I was going to do afterwards, and that's definitely okay. But on the other hand, it helps a little bit to think about what kinds of things you want to do to keep options open. You know, there are differences between choosing an academic career or going out into industry or the corporate world in some ways. But they're nothing like as stark as you might possibly imagine. For an academic career, you certainly want to aim for the best possible dissertation, because that is part of the substrate on which letters of recommendation are written, which is what gets you the first job. A few years hence, the dissertation becomes less cosmic, but the first job is a good one to think about. And it's good if it can stand on its own to some extent. For instance, for me, it was important to get letters of recommendation for people other than my home institution, because Caltech has a small mathematics department. There really was pretty much only my own advisor who would be writing letters of recommendation. And I could have asked others who are not in the field, but they cannot speak much about the substance of it. So in my case, I actually had to rely on the majority of my letter writers being from a different institution, reading the dissertation and based on the dissertation saying something. And that meant that it had to be the dissertation as such, which does actually include the ability to sell what you have done. So the dissertation just works better for this purpose too if it reads well. If it's readily apparent to someone reading this dissertation what's new in it and why it's interesting. And also, if there's some clarity, it could be that among the people reading it and forming a judgment, there are those who know the subject very well. They may not need to be told why it's interesting, or if they're told they may not believe it. That would be the bad scenario. But they may be interested in actually getting through the technical detail, and that's obscure, that doesn't help them. So clarity in all these respects is a good thing. Actually selling your work well is a fairly universal thing in a career later on as well. So let me start with the dissertation, but then also go on to other aspects of it. As you saw, note, by the way, Don is about to defend his dissertation this Friday. Hope he'll come. He'll be right in this room. And we were just talking about how to actually the abstract, which is, if you think about it, the last thing you want to write when you have it all and you've thought about this very carefully, gone through everything over and over again. And part of what the abstract should indicate, space permitting, is what's new about this. And I'm not going to tell you what his dissertation is about in detail, at least not right now, but he's doing something in a context where there's a range of parameters, and the particular interval of parameters where a known result says for almost every parameter you have something that his thesis is interested in. What his dissertation does is he finds within this interval several intervals of parameters such that for all values of these parameters the desired conclusion actually holds. Now one way of looking at this is, well, he goes and diminishes null set, right? We already know that there's only null set of exceptions. Okay, and he goes beyond that, so it's an incremental refinement of the result. That's one way of looking at it. But there's another way of looking at it too, and I think that's pertinent to making clear how much of a difference the method and the result makes, which is, so far for his work, there was not a single parameter known in this interval for which you could say the conclusion actually holds. Right? And he changes that. He gives entire intervals over which he can say it's definitely true. So that's a matter of framing of what he has done in a way that makes clear that there is something beyond tweaking null sets to the method he has developed. And that's not just useful for the dissertation. Throughout a mathematician's career, though, would be important if you want to make sure that your paper gets published when you have one. You want to make clear to referees that there's enough that makes it worthwhile for a journal. You also, in the abstract, want to make clear to readers that it's worth their time to read the paper. Likewise, you may want to make clear to funding agencies that what you propose is worth funding, it's worth money. And likewise, of course, in a job application, you want to make sure that people believe that you're worth hiring, and in this case, on the basis of your research. And often that is a matter of framing things, right? We didn't change Don's result to change the abstract. We just looked at the ways in which, within this context, it can be put inside a category where it is clearly at the top of the context within which the abstract discusses what has been done. In fact, it may be pertinent to seize many opportunities to do so. For instance, this graduate research symposium is a good thing to attend because you will see other graduate students that have prepared very well for presenting something and to the general public. So you may hear physicists, chemists, or people in the department giving their talks. By the way, I've gone there previously. One interesting thing is just that different disciplines have really different cultures for how they present their things. Just that in itself is of some interest. But going to any talk, and that includes our colloquia, it includes our seminars, it includes our dissertation defenses, and in fact includes job talks given by candidates who come here and want a job in this department. Those are not only opportunities to learn about new content, new mathematics in our department, but also to be exposed to a variety of different ways of presenting things. And I wasn't very systematic about that when I was a graduate student, but there was one example I do remember. I unfortunately do not remember the name of the person involved. When I interviewed for the job here, which I'm not spoiling the story by saying that I got it eventually, I was here this day, and it turned out they were interviewing for another job in this department on the same day. This was a job that Montserrat Teixeira got in the end. And at some point in the afternoon, they weren't quite sure what to do with me. And they said, well, you know, there happens to be this job talk for this other field, and most of us are going to go there, and feel free to attend. So, okay, I'll go. And so I listened to this job talk, and like I said, I was a bit naive about life, the universe, and everything. But I could tell at the end of the talk that this person wasn't getting the job. And there's some learning from bad examples. In this case, the time management was off a bit more than slightly. He didn't get to the main point of his talk by the time the talk was over. It was pretty clear that that wasn't exactly helpful in a place that pays attention to teaching. Another thing that's presenting yourself in particular departments when you look for academic jobs, but to some extent I think this applies as well to interviewing in industry. One standard thing in academic job talks is, or interviews rather, is that you do give a job talk, right? So you go up there and talk about what you've done. And one thing that's good to know is that one size doesn't fit all. If you come and interview at Tufts and give a job talk here, and then you go off to Penn State and give a job talk there, and then you go to Bowdoin and give a job talk there, if you give the same job talk in all three places, two of these talks are going to fail likely, because they serve very different purposes. I visited institutions where, if I understand correctly, the hiring process works as follows. There are ads out in the usual places, including math jobs. We have a position in mathematics subject to approval of the dean. Applications are invited and there's a deadline. It's rather vague, it's not very field specific. Subject to approval of the dean. They don't know if they have a job. You just tell people, if you want a job, apply. If you don't apply, we can't give you a job. The things I'm inferring, I can promise that they're actually true, is that they don't read any of the applications. Instead, the people who care call up their buddies. Do you have any good students coming home? And so you get your algebraic geometry department and some dynamicists and a few algebraists and then a few applied mathematicians and this and the other in a committee sort of duking out as to who gets invited to give a job talk. The function then of the job talk is to be pretty darn impressive to a department or rather a committee of people who's not really read anything. And research is what it's all about. Here at Tufts, we have all read the applications. We have really thought about who gets invited. We're also very specific as to field. So the talk is about research, but frankly, we've read about the research. So it is much more about, well, what does this person feel like when giving a talk? And that's both the research end, how well is this person able to answer questions about the world that aren't already explicitly addressed, but also what kinds of expectations do we have for this person in the classroom in the calculus class? Now, it's a stretch to infer that from a research talk, but one can often tell. So a job talk at the first kind of institution should focus on just pushing your stuff as hard as possible, make it sound majorly impressive. When we invite people here, we're already impressed with the research. It's more about getting it across very clearly to a hiring committee that is largely but not entirely in the area. With other places, in fact, you may be asked instead of giving a research talk to do effectively mock class. Well, then at least it's explicit. In any case, it makes sense to make an educated guess and maybe to ask if you're invited for a job interview. Well, tell me about the purpose of the job interview, or rather job talk, within the interview day. Can you tell me anything? Worst cases, they tell you something that's not helpful, but they might tell you exactly the kind of thing you should be looking for is the following. One normal question to ask is, what's the audience? Are you inviting a good percentage of undergraduate students or graduate students, or is it just a hiring committee, is it faculty only? Certainly how well you cater to that audience is a measure of how much you care to prepare for the job, if nothing else. One more thing about the academic market, then I'll talk a little bit about outside academia more or less, but In terms of time planning, it's not a bad idea to have your dissertation substantially done by the fall of the year in which you actually hit the job market, the academic year in which you do. Of course, there's lots of writing still to be done at that stage. That's fine. But for me, for instance, had to be substantially in place because I was going to ask people who weren't in my department to write letters. So I had to be able to send them something from which they could figure out what it is that I'd done. And they had to write the letters in time for the job market to work and all that. So that meant by fall, things had to be more or less in place. And well, substantially, that's the same thing whether or not you ask outside people. It really helps by that time to be pretty close to done. The additional plus is it could be that your dissertation, as often the case, consists of not just one single result, but in fact an accumulation of various things that individually are publishable as well. That time table in mind, you will increase your chances that of these things, one, at least, maybe another one is submitted, maybe even accepted. Given the publication lag is probably not yet published, but it adds to the record that you present. So that is additional proof that there is much that's worthwhile in the dissertation because acceptance for publication is external validation, so there is real substance there. It sends you well on your track. It also means that once the, when the fall semester hits, the job market is a bit of a time-consuming thing. Right, so the fall semester of that last year is not the best semester in which to add majorly to your dissertation, and if you have to, then suddenly time management becomes an issue. Let me digress now to industry a little bit, or let's say outside of academia. At the joint mathematics meetings, they had a panel on jobs in mathematics, and that included representatives from industry. And one thing I found interesting and worth thinking about in what they said is that, here's an obvious thing, right? If your doctorate is in applied mathematics, you're going to go pretty good to industry. That's not terribly surprising. What was of interest is that that's by no means necessary. They will take just about any because, by achieving a doctorate in mathematics, you have demonstrated that you are really sharp. You also have the tenacity that it takes to pursue a project for an extended period of time and to achieve at a high level. What they would like to see for people going into industry is some willingness to learn what one needs in order to do what that company or employer actually needs you to do. But that doesn't need a heck of a lot. So for instance, having taken some substantial computer science classes or something of that sort demonstrates that you're not interested in being the algebraic geometer in this high-tech company, which may not make a heck of a lot of sense, but rather somebody who has done serious mathematics but is interested in adding to the portfolio of methods to be in fact useful and employable in this context. Beyond that, it's not usually crucial what exactly you've done in your dissertation. In pure mathematics, most of the things aren't exactly the thing that is immediately applicable to industry anyway. The mental skills definitely are. In terms of selling yourself, actually, there's one thing on the academic side I should add also. As I mentioned down the road, job applications, grants, and the like. One thing that is worth thinking about near the end of the career is to apply for an NSF postdoc. Even if you don't get it, it's a good exercise in thinking about what is your research plan for going out from graduate school. It is good practice in beginning to sell this. And thinking ahead is a good thing anyway, because nowadays with job applications, it's usually standard that people do want to say a research statement that says something about a plan anyway. The plus is, especially in this job market, if you get an NSF postdoc, you're a freebie to the institution where you're actually doing it. And that means even if their budget is in terrible shape, they'll be happy to take you because you're coming with your own rather with federal money. That's what Aaron Brown did, and he went to Penn State to do that. A related thing is practice makes perfect. So I was lucky to have opportunities for giving talks. We had a pretty active working seminar in dynamics when I was a graduate student. Those of you in geometric group theory topology have the obvious venue for that, but there are other seminars here as well, in algebra and geometry and the like, and in dynamics of an order also, depending on the number of students. But it doesn't have to be internally necessarily. As your work progresses and you begin to have results that are worth presenting, you could try to start thinking about finagling talks, at least at local level institutions. And just, was it yesterday, I think, as I was talking with Don, he was telling me, thank you for making me give a talk at BU last fall. Because he has to prepare for his defense, which is later this week. And he gave a talk about that. That needs tweaking, but he's not preparing it from scratch. And even if it's not that close a relationship, you know, if you're talking about something that is only a small part of what you ultimately defend, it's just good practice. It's good practice in many ways. I remember from my earlier talks, then I got questions for which I wasn't really prepared. And it taught me about, well, first of all, I should have thought about that in the first place. The question shouldn't have come up. And secondly, even if I don't talk about everything, I should be prepared for the kinds of questions that do possibly arise. And they were good questions. It actually led to one interesting opportunity. Let's take some guesses. How much in advance do you think I knew about the very first conference talk I gave? Any guesses?
None.
None.
Close.
$1.
5 minutes. It's not bad, but it wasn't. You know, the thing is simply it was a conference that took place at Caltech, and I had just maybe only a week or two prior, fairly recently given a talk about my dissertation subject, which had progressed pretty well by then. And I showed up for the first talk of the conference, and my advisor was running the conference said, the first speaker didn't show up. Can you talk? I said, yes, I can. And it was nice and essentially free way of getting exposure. It took some nerves to say, oh, okay. But, so it was good that this wasn't my first talk period, but that in fact I had a prior experience talking about, I should say, not only my own work. So the first talks I gave were picking up a paper or collection of papers and presenting those. So I was presenting the work of others, and that's where I learned the kinds of questions I should have been thinking about and preparing for talking about it and hadn't. That wasn't a very useful lesson. It's really a way of learning actually to do mathematics and to think about it. I should say there is, in addition to the things I mentioned, job talks and like, there's our colloquiums as well as seminars, and that's a good thing to go. The colloquium is something that's not meant to be disciplinary. So if you are in, say, GTT and you go to the seminar there, you expect to understand the talks. When you go to the colloquium, well, you know, this talk is most likely something that's not in your field. And it is par for the course, that you follow for a while and beyond the point it's just whatever, Greek to me, and there we go. Well, that doesn't mean that you don't get anything out of the 5 or 10 minutes during which you actually follow what's going on. And it doesn't mean that you can't get other things out of it. For instance, if you get lost in the first minute, you can spend the rest of the time watching your speaker and figuring out what things not to do in a talk, because there may be a good chance you find quite a few of those. That too is a nice learning experience. Or you may find a brilliant colloquium talk. You can ask yourself as it goes, well, what is it that makes it so good? You know, it's one thing to enjoy it, it's another one to think about what it is that makes it enjoyable, what helps get it across. And that's a little bit in the spirit of my recommendation for going to the Graduate Research Symposium. You'll find the students there who work very hard to talk to an audience that's not even in their department, but outside. And I expect you'll see some very good examples, and you may see some that are not as successful. I suspect you won't see any really bad ones because people are not inclined to do this part of which was hung up in the first place. Let me talk about theses a little bit. I talk a tad about, well, how do you work with your advisor? And like I said, it's a matter of personalities. But it's also important in terms of the mathematical interaction. And, with my advisor, it really was such that he thought of ideas for problems to work on. In fact, the first one I worked on didn't get very far, and the second one I finally went someplace, although it turned out not in the expected direction. turned out to work out in some fashion or another. On the other hand, some advisors simply choose to let people find their own problems and then work on them and then provide guidance in how it goes along. They may try to help formulate the problem more clearly or steer someone away from a problem that doesn't look promising, either too hard or too easy, or in an area where the advisor is not confident that the advice will be particularly useful down the road. I've done both flavors. My first PhD student did a dissertation on a problem that actually I'd heard about not too long before he seriously started, and that turned out to work out fairly beautifully. I can tell a bit about the question because it's sort of adorable. One thing in dynamics that provides a nice toy problem is to think about billiards, and mathematical billiards are, well, what you look at is you take a figure, let's say for now in the plane, for instance, and you think of, let's take a closed curve. An ellipse is a popular example. A rectangle would be the one you actually use in the pool hall. You can think of other shapes, and you can think about a particle moving inside, and when it hits the boundary, just having angle in equals angle out when it's being reflected off the boundary. That's not what a physical ball does, because spin does make a difference, but it is what a ray of light would do in a mirrored chamber. So it is an interesting physical model. In particular, if you think about the point mass, which has no spin with the light ray moving, it's basic physics, in fact, in the Hamiltonian system. It turns out that when you, that's not hard to see actually. If you think, well, this is supposed to be something that models, for instance, an actual particle moving, or maybe a multitude of particles moving, here's something you can do, and this motivates some of what people have done. Suppose you think about thermodynamics at the atomic or molecular level. So think of, you have a box, and in it you have these balls that are bouncing around, being bounced off the edges and each other in this rigid fashion, no friction and all that. And let's assume there is no spin interchange, because that's the question, how do you handle that? So this, of course, is something where you think about a three-dimensional box, but with lots of little individual balls in there that are bouncing around. But it turns out that if you take your centers of masses, all of them combined, as a vector of suitable size, 3 times the number of particles, then you can actually describe an enclosure in a space of that dimension within which the entire configuration is a point that moves around, and when it hits the boundary of that enclosure, it goes with angle in equals angle out. It actually is just straight line motion with rigid reflections of the boundary. The boundary in this case is going to be something like a high-dimensional box, but with cylindrical holes drilled through it, which correspond to the fact that two things cannot overlap. That gives you something that has the kind of constraint that turns out to be cylindrical. So one question that was in the air as well, this is all well and good, it's a nifty model that you can use to try to think about whether the probabilistic approach to statistical mechanics is actually warranted. In short, the ergodicity of the system. We do this kind of thing with a box and spherical particles. That problem is very hard and remains unsolved, but people have made enough progress that the question was in the air of what happens when you actually do interchange spin. And with spherical particles, it may not be entirely natural, because what is the mechanism for interchanging spin? There was some notion of, let's make them sticky, so something sticks as they hit each other. And that turned out to be not very pleasant and a bit ugly. And it's also not natural. Where spin comes in is when you have molecules, where the particles are not spherical. And then, of course, it does make sense that spin is really substantial. Well, so that was a problem I posed to David. I said, well, suppose you do this, but your particles are not spherical. Can you still model it as a point brilliant? You know, is there still a point moving in some enclosure with angle in equals angle? Turns out the answer was, which is nice. And that was one of 2 papers, because next thing he did is looked at the kinds of enclosures that you get when you do this. It turns out they're not straight boxes, they're sort of wobbly on the edges because of the wobbly shape of these things. And what he proved was, unfortunately in the second paper, somewhat negative result. It's going to be fiendishly hard to do anything with this. The known techniques just don't really apply very well. But those two publications that came out. With my more recent students, it was mostly self-selected problems that they worked on. And that's a slightly taller order, to find your own problem and do something. On the other hand, well, frankly, it can affect the strength of the recommendation I can give later. Because after all, when you're out, and certainly beyond the postdoc stage, you don't have anybody to give you problems, which to some extent is the hard part. And it is a good thing to be able to say, well, here's somebody who picked this problem and made it work. But that's a bit of a decision. What do you think will work for you? And I've certainly been seriously involved in shaping the problem, adding some direction to it, and maybe helping the selection. But it's sort of a matter of taste and how it works out. Another thing is, of course, how do you like the interaction? And do you like to be yourself with an advisor? Is it supposed to be a pair? I was lucky in that there was a larger research group, and in our department you have a bit of a choice. There are some relationships that are maybe a bit more one-to-one, others are a bit more part of the group. It's a matter of taste, and taste can change as well. At some point a few years ago, I was looking back at my own CV with, and noticing something that hadn't occurred to me prior, which was that, as is usually the case in pure mathematics, my dissertation was published in my name only. In some fields of pure mathematics and more applied mathematics, the advisors will usually have the name of those as well. But my research publications had my name on it. And a few years out of grad school, I kept producing publications that were just my own. And then at some point I did a collaboration with somebody who was, for that moment, at Harvard and later moved to the Midwest. And I've never done a solo paper since. So I found, in my case at least, once I started collaborating, I never stopped. I've never done anything entirely by myself anymore. It was interesting, just last week I was talking to Jordan Ellenberg, and someone mentioned this, and he said, the same thing for him. And he started solo, and he's never gone back to it once he collaborated. And other people go back and forth. It can work both ways. It's once again a matter of personality. What I found for me is that, at least in my view, the work I've done with others has been much more interesting than the work I did just by myself. I'm not positive that the outside world sees it that way, but I didn't just have more fun, I think, the kind of questions I'm more. Good. So I was hoping to be interrupted by many questions, but I think maybe it makes sense to, for now, call this it for the things I was going to just say. I'm hoping that maybe this prompted some questions, because I think there's a lot more one could say about it. So trying to make up a few more things, I'm wondering whether there's anything that comes to mind from what I've said.
If, for example, you're working on one dissertation project and say halfway through you decide you don't want to do this anymore and you want to work with somebody else, you have to go all the way back to the beginning, or?
That depends a little bit. Because, for instance, it depends on the department and the available options. It could well be that there is somebody else who's close enough to the same area that he could go part of the way back and do something slightly different, or even that there's somebody close enough that he could continue with a different advisor on essentially the same project. But it could also be that you work with a lone person in the department who's in this discipline altogether, in which case the decision is much harder to call a day and go to someone else. It is certainly possible. There are also arrangements possible for having two advisors, and that can be different ways. So most of you remember Thomas Barthelme, who was here for 2 semesters, not successive ones. And he started out as a student of Patrick Foulon, a collaborator of mine in France, and then I took on the role of being the co-advisor of his, because his work overlapped with joint things that we're working on. We've also had students in this department whose advisor in the main was somebody at a different local institution. MIT comes to mind foremost. There have been several students in probabilities advisor was at MIT, and his advisor, Frank Werner Topps, was larger in France. So I could see even within this department that there were some clusters of faculty where we could make the change from one advisor to another without radically affecting the field in which the dissertation will be done. It's a case-by-case thing, and there's a bit of thinking also in terms of weighing the quality of dissertation against the time spent getting there. In the end, people don't look too closely at exactly how long it took, unless it's really strange, right? I mean, 17 years to PhD would be very strange. 6 years, well, okay, that's okay, right? 9, okay, that'll be good. So there is a bit of, consideration there as well. At some point, it's a matter of getting it done and hoping for the best thereafter as well. But there is also, I should say this, when I found my advisor, or rather when you found me, whichever way you want to look at it, maybe it was apparent from the story, at least implicit in it, that I didn't choose dynamical systems from abstract considerations only. My choice had a lot to do with the people I encountered and when I did encounter them. There is, in fact, looking at circumstances in which I found myself at the time I was making this decision, it could well have happened that I might have gone into harmonic analysis and now be somebody who works on wavelengths. Okay, I would have lived about as happily ever after too, just doing something mathematically pretty different. For me, things worked out beautifully this way. They might have worked out equally beautiful another way, or not. You never know. But the decisions very often just have to do with circumstances. If you really don't get along with an advisor, the question is, well, do I stick it out and get done anyway, and everything works out all right in the end, or is it so bad that is it just not going to work out and it's worth some intellectual delay or something else to shift around? Those are the situations where you might have to consult with others too, because that's of course situation dependent. It's a bit of soul searching. That's not easy to do. We have had tough students changing universities because of very specific ideas what they wanted to do, and these did not involve things that are represented in this department. One of them I remember from my grad analysis class. He went off to Penn State to do something there, and has been doing very well there. It's gone great, but he was very specific. He came from physics. Here's something he wanted to do. It was something that we didn't even remotely do, but it's what he wanted. We found a place that does it, and it worked out very nicely. So that's a possibility too. The plus, of course, we have here is, like I said, we have MIT nearby, we have Boston University nearby, we have 8 research universities in this area. So if there's something not in our department, that doesn't mean that it's necessary to leave this department in order to write a dissertation in something that's available in this area. It does help to be close enough to some faculty member here that there are connections that facilitate finding an alternate advisor in this area, to be the real supervisor. And it's not happened very often that it's been done, but it can be done. And when it has been done, it seems to have succeeded every time. Corollary, by the way, to getting it done fast is get the calls done as early as it can. Yeah.
Well, I was just kind of wondering how much autonomy we would have in the dissertation process. So, like, will we be completely responsible for all the research and we just spew out our ideas to our advisor once a week, or is it more collaborative? Like, does the advisor actually contribute to the research in some ways?
Well, that is exactly one of the things that depends on the pair involved. I would think that in our department, every advisor I can think of tends to be on the fairly collaborative side, which does mean that the ultimate responsibility is yours, but at the same time, the advisor feels a responsibility for enabling you to succeed. But certainly in the mathematical universe, it's not always that way. At Caltech, I saw a stark contrast between the relationship I had with my advisor, who was always available, always full of ideas, and really had a strong sense of responsibility for making things work out well, with, well, in particular, one other colleague at Caltech, whose idea was that he'd spend about 5 minutes thinking up a problem that might be a dissertation, and then expected not to be bothered until it was done. And if he was going to be bothered in between, the way to do it was to make an appointment with the secretary 2 weeks in advance. A friend of mine who was one of his students did that at some point, and in that meeting said, okay, I have a theorem to the effect that this approach doesn't work. Please suggest the approach. And this advisor said, well, that's unfortunate. And my friend was waiting, and it was clear that was meant to be the end of the conversation. My friend lived happily ever after, but he did not choose an academic career, and I think you can imagine that he wasn't exactly encouraged to do that. This is an extreme example of which I don't think you'll find any in this department, but there are different styles, and I think you'll try to get a sense, again, partly from current students, just what it is like to work with any one particular person. And there is a bit of a range. Here in this department, the common thing is, I think, the sense of responsibility of making the students succeed, and generally the attitude of we're in this together as colleagues, as advisor and student and the like, so that there is quite a bit of interaction and constant direction. I usually make a habit of meeting with my students weekly, so much as possible, sometimes more often when it's quick or urgent, and often at regular times because that makes a bit more sure that it actually happens, but additionally as needed. And it's then, you know, often there will be meetings where, okay, I'm here and now what? It's a matter of trying to find out or figure out as much as possible together, of course, what one could do to go beyond the obstacle at the top. So you get a spectrum. It's a matter of figuring out where it lies and how you like it.
One more. So if some of our interests diverge slightly from potential advisors, would that be kind of the end of the world, or would advisors, at least at Tufts, be willing to explore new territory for their students?
Yeah, there is some of that. In fact, certainly some of my students have done things that I would never have picked up myself. The plus is that there's enough clustering in the department that some of it might fall between advisors, and just enough of a way that finding 2 or 1.5 advisors makes it easier to do something that isn't right down the alley of one of the people in the department. If that's not enough, one can look once again 2 other places in town where there's a relationship both with the advisor here, who's the closest within the department, as well as somebody outside who's hopefully very close to on target for that subject. So it's definitely not the end of the world. If, like I said, there was this one student I remember was very specific in his interest, and there was absolutely no overlap. And given that there was no overlap here at all, he then felt free, of course, to just look everywhere as opposed to just in this region, a good match. It's not the end of the world. It's the kind of thing that involves figuring out, and it may turn out that interests shift in response to increased awareness of things that are maybe related and a better match for faculty as well. So it's really, on one end, faculty, for the most part, I think may be interested in exploring something new, but it may turn out the other way around too, that there are things that are close by, equally interesting, and closer to the expertise of somebody already here. But that's the kind of thing that is part of the figuring out process. Where are we as a pair, or where am I as somebody looking for a good match going to go to figure out how this can be made to work? And that's it's a very good question.
This week, what is your favorite math book?
This week, what's my favorite math book? One of my favorites ever is, I think it's called Does God Play Dice by Ian Stewart. It's not strictly math, but it's a well-written account. And it's inspiring reading. One of my academic brothers actually went to the University of Warwick, where Ian Stewart is, and worked with him. And sometime later I asked my friend, how does Stewart even do it? Because he's writing up the wazoo. He's an active researcher, and yet he was writing for the Scientific American all the time, and then it turns out one book after the other. And my friend said, well, basically, what works is that when he writes his first draft, it's very easy to submit it. And saves a lot of time. And that's not me. I can do pretty good writing, but the first draft is never right. Just take a lot of stepping back, thinking about it, rearranging the words on the page, and rearranging the ideas. And that's time worth spending. But some people have a gift and it comes out right the first time every time. That is great. And by the way, that is some, I talk about selling yourself, and that is the practice of talking and the like, but it is really the craft of writing helps a great deal. And it does help in the obvious sense, publications, grant proposals and the like. But in my job right now, in terms of quantity of words, far and away the most writing I do is not about mathematics. It's emails, it's memos, it's reports, and the like. And they work better when they're well written. And that works better when, with practice, it takes few iterations to get it close enough to good. At the same time, at some point you've got to decide it is good enough. There's also a way of just tweaking forever and ever and ever, and then tweaking some more, and never getting something out until it's no longer very interesting. It's a bit of a balance. And in my case, I've conflicting genetics, which is that on my mother's side it's the compulsive type to get it all right, and on my father's side it's the, oh well, it's good enough. And so I find myself shifting between these two at the start, and I get compulsive, and there's, oh, okay, I'm done with it, good enough. Unfortunately, that is about the right thing. It's supposed to be done with it too soon, and then later discovering I should be compulsive, it wasn't. It varies a bit. But that experience adds to that, but I think it's also a bit of a reflection on how is the writing going. I was lucky to get lots of practice with mathematical writing because I started a project in my graduate student days that wound up going to 800 pages. Only because neither I nor my co-author ever expected to go that large. We would have tried it. But that combined with feedback from publishers and the like was the thing.
Did you found an area of research?
No, I don't think I did. I think this book has had a big influence on research in dynamical systems. Of my research papers, I once looked actually, the main paper that came out of my dissertation work is the one that is most cited, which is interesting since I just told you I found my later work much more interesting. There's of course a bias of age, right? I mean, it's the oldest one, so there's been more time for others to cite it, so one should take that into account. On the other hand, that did something that was just novel enough to involve a bit of an issue of research work.
How many pages was your dissertation?
Well, there are two different counts. The dissertation that was submitted at the university was, I forget now, ballpark 80, give or take. The publications that resulted from it were under 30. There was one 3-page paper, and in fact the point of this paper was that it took only 3 pages. It generalized a paper that had taken 9 pages and was more self-contained in that paper. So that was the point. And then the main thing that got cited more often wound up in publication being in the low 20s. But I can go either way. Dissertations aren't bought by the pound. I think some of you went to the Wiener lecture where I said that the Wiener's dissertation involved defining the ordered pair. It's a bit more than that. It was not being shown, but that was actually the core thing. And you don't read about much because Kwiatkowski later gave a definition of it, so there's always reason to do that. But, I remember in my graduate student days actually going to talk at USC where a young French mathematician talked about a problem that had been around for quite some time in dynamics, related vaguely to can you hear the shape of a drum, although not literally. And I was sitting in the same row as my advisor, Katok, and I saw his jaw drop during the talk, and it just never went back up. Because the idea was really simple. First of all, it was a problem on which some big guns had worked without getting anywhere. And then there's this young runt who comes up with a really simple idea that once published was like, I don't know, 5 pages could articulate that. In fact, this was a French dissertation, and he had trouble with his university saying, this can't be a dissertation, it's way too short. Until, there was letters from outside people saying, yes, it's a dissertation, it's really good. And then there are other things that, are well over 100 pages, and that's good too. It depends a bit on the field. It depends, sometimes there's one gem of an idea that is so profound that it takes very little time to make anything of it, and it's breakthrough. Other times it is something that's lengthy, and my guide seems to have a bit of a range of pages. So the main thing is the substance of it, not so much. In terms of writing, of course, the dissertation is meant to be the one that has the more discursive, leisurely style of writing. Whereas for publication, one is usually asked to trim it down. So the thing that is a bit of a theme is that the ratio between my dissertation and its published version is not unusual at all. It's majorly trimmed down.
So when you publish your dissertation, you're not actually publishing the whole thing?
It varies. It could be that it's essentially one problem that winds up being one publication, but it would be something where you trim majorly. A dissertation is supposed to say rather more than often a published paper about sort of the context in which the work was done and the like. For publication, it's assumed that somebody who's reading it either knows the context or doesn't care. The publication itself is supposed to be about what's the new thing itself, rather than a lengthy discussion about why it's new or what else has been done. So the dissertation is meant to be something more leisurely. But that's actually a good question. How do you write it? Because one possibility is you write the dissertation and then are prepared to trim it down to publication. Another one is, as you write the dissertation, at some point you decide to separate these out and finish writing the dissertation while finishing the publication as well. Both could work. It's in effect a delicate judgment call at which point you bifurcate, because you don't want to duplicate too much effort in writing the two things. On the other hand, if you have clear ideas of what the paper is going to look like and the dissertation, then if you have the common core and then splice it out, it may in fact be more efficient to write them independently rather than writing something that needs to be trimmed down and then re-added and cause more problems in its work. That's an interesting judgment call. But it can be one publication. In my case it was two, in some others it's more than that. Aaron Brown's dissertation involved one result, which would be a publication in itself. He had two previous papers out which he chose not to include. That's okay too, because the third one is good enough. So it's a variety of options, and that is where your judgment, that of your advisor, is probably the first to consult.
So when you're applying for jobs, how much of your work will the committee probably read? I mean, it's unlikely that they would read your dissertation when they could just read your publications.
That's right, and this depends very much on the place, and to some extent also you can tell a bit from the job ad. So for instance, our job ads are very specific. We're seeking somebody working in this field. It's not just algebra, it's much more focused than that. And you might make an inference, which in this case is correct, that as a consequence the hiring committee largely consists of people who know this area. Which means that there is at least a greater likelihood that they're going to read the publications. You might include the dissertation as something that's attached, but it's more often the case that you post it someplace, like on the archive, where those who want to read it, as opposed to having, 80 or 100 page file just because you included the dissertation. They're more likely to look at the publication. Those who are interested might look more deeply, others not so much. The essence of what's there really would be in the publication. The dissertation is looked at a little bit less than that, but it might. It certainly would if there is no publication or preprint available, right? So, for instance, Aaron's job applications wrote on the two publications that were actually out and could be attached or viewed on the archive. And then there was a dissertation actually in the latter stages of the job market that was on the archive as well, so you didn't need to include the dissertation. But it's conceivable, in fact, this is a good way of doing it. That's one reason to be done early enough that in fact lots of stuff is publicly available, therefore doesn't need to be included with an application, but can be seen by those who need the application. But it's conceivable that in the end, you have this dissertation and nothing is out yet. In that case, it certainly makes sense to make sure that it's available in some way so people do want to look at it, But I find it a nice thing to make it a public document by putting it, say, on the archive. One should do that early enough, because if you do it after it's totally official, there may be copyright issues, oddly enough. But if, when it's close enough, near defense time, if you put it in the archive at that point, it can stay there. The reason I say that is there are numerous instances where dissertations are cited because somehow the dissertation wound up never being published, which means the only way to refer to something having been proved is to refer to dissertation. And if it's not in the archive, it can be very difficult to find because lots of the dissertation archives aren't public. And then you're sort of sunk. Basically, then you get into people citing something because they think something's in there, because they see it being cited from elsewhere. And it's better asking friends where it is, and you're not quite sure where it's quoted exactly. So, in a way, there is some public service done in making the dissertation such publicly available, even if the readership turns out to be small. In particular, it could be that in trimming things down for publication, that we concentrate so much on the main results, because the journal requires it, that something of independent interest happens to disappear and not be big enough for a separate publication. It could be that for some other people that thing is the thing they're interested in. It helps them make insight which is okay. Aside from being out there and you're really good about it and your friends and family can look at it too.
Great. I think we should probably call there. If anyone has any other questions for Boris, feel free to ask him afterwards. So let's thank Boris for coming today.